Chapter 7, Part 1 of New Grub Street. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alan Brown. New Grub Street by George Gissing. Chapter 7, Marian's Home. 3 weeks after her return from the country, which took place a week later than that of Jasper Milvain, Marian Yule was working one afternoon at her usual place in the museum reading room. It was 3 o'clock, and with the interval of half an hour at midday, when she went away for a cup of tea and a sandwich, she had been closely occupied since 9:30. Her task at present was to collect materials for a paper on French authoresses of the 17th century, the kind of thing which her father supplied on stipulated terms for anonymous publication. Marian was by this time almost able to complete such a piece of manufacture herself, and her father's share in it was limited to a few hints and corrections. The greater part of the work by which Yule earned his moderate income was anonymous. Volumes and articles which bore his signature dealt with much of the same subjects as his unsigned matter, but the writing was laboured with a conscientiousness unusual in men of his position. The result, unhappily, was not correspondent with the efforts. Alfred Yule had made a recognisable name among the critical writers of the day. Seeing him in the title lists of a periodical, most people knew what to expect, but not a few forbore the cutting open of the pages he occupied. He was learned, copious, occasionally mordant in style, but grace had been denied him. He had of late begun to perceive the fact that those passages of Marian's writing which were printed just as they came from her pen had a merit of a kind quite distinct from anything of which he himself was capable, and it began to be a question with him whether it would not be advantageous to let the girl sign these compositions. A matter of business, to be sure, at all events in the first instance. For a long time Marian had scarcely looked up from the desk, but at this moment she found it necessary to refer to the invaluable Larousse. As so often happened, the particular volume of which she had need was not upon the shelf. She turned away and looked about her with a gaze of weary disappointment. At a little distance were standing 2 young men, engaged, as their faces showed, in facetious colloquy. As soon as she observed them, Marian's eyes fell, but the next moment she looked again in that direction. Her face had wholly changed. She wore a look of timid expectancy. The men were moving towards her, still talking and laughing. She turned to the shelves, and affected to search for a book. The voices drew near, and one of them was well known to her. Now she could hear every word. Now the speakers were gone by. Was it possible that Mr. Milvain had not recognized her? She followed him with her eyes, and saw him take a seat not far off. He must have passed without even being aware of her. She went back to her place, and for some minutes sat trifling with a pen. When she made a show of resuming work, it was evident that she could no longer apply herself as before. Every now and then she glanced at people who were passing. There were intervals when she wholly lost herself in reverie. She was tired, and had even a slight headache. When the hand of the clock pointed to 3:30, she closed the volume from which she had been copying extracts, and began to collect her papers. A voice spoke close behind her. "Where's your father, Miss Yule?" The speaker was a man of 60, short, stout, tonsured by the hand of time. He had a broad flabby face, the colour of an ancient turnip, save where one of the cheeks was marked with a mulberry stain. His eyes, grey-orbed in a yellow setting, glared with good-humoured inquisitiveness, and his mouth was that of the confirmed gossip. For eyebrows he had 2 little patches of reddish stubble. For moustache, what looked like a bit of discoloured tow, and scraps of similar material hanging beneath his creasy chin represented a beard. His garb must have seen a great deal of museum service. It consisted of a jacket, something between brown and blue, hanging in capacious shapelessness, a waistcoat half open for lack of buttons, and with one of the pockets coming unsewn, a pair of bronze-hued trousers which had all run to knee. Necktie he had none, and his linen made distinct appeal to the laundress. Marian shook hands with him. "He went away at 2:30, was her reply to his question. "How annoying! I wanted particularly to see him. I have been running about all day and couldn't get here before. Something important. Most important. At all events, I can tell you. But I entreat you that you won't breathe a word save to your father." Mr. Quarmby, that was his name, had taken a vacant chair and drawn it close to Marian's. He was in a state of joyous excitement, and talked in thick, rather pompous tones, with a pant at the end of a sentence. To emphasize the extremely confidential nature of his remarks, he brought his head almost in contact with the girl's, and one of her thin, delicate hands was covered with his red, podgy fingers. "I've had a talk with Nathaniel Walker," he continued, "a long talk, a talk of vast importance. You know Walker?" No, how should you? He's a man of business, close friend of Rackett, you know, the owner of The Study." Upon this he made a grave pause, and glared more excitedly than ever. "I have heard of Mr. Rackett," said Marian. Of course. And you must also have heard that Fadge leaves The Study at the end of the year, eh? Father told me it was probable. Rackett and he have done nothing but quarrel for months. The paper is falling off seriously. Well now, when I came across Nat Walker this afternoon, the first thing he said to me was, 'You know Alfred Yule pretty well, I think?' 'Pretty well,' I answered. 'Why?' 'I'll tell you,' he said, 'but it's between you and me, you understand. Rackett is thinking about him in connection with The Study.' 'I'm delighted to hear it.' 'To tell you the truth,' went on Nat, 'I shouldn't wonder if Yule gets the editorship. But you understand that it would be altogether premature to talk about it. Now what do you think of this, eh?' 'It's very good news,' answered Marian. 'I should think so. Ho, ho!' Mr. Quarmby laughed in a peculiar way, which was the result of long years of mirth subdual in the reading room. 'But not a breath to anyone but your father. He'll be here to-morrow. Break it gently to him, you know. He's an excitable man, can't take things quietly like I do. Ho, ho!' His suppressed laugh ended in a fit of coughing, the reading room cough. When he had recovered from it, he pressed Marian's hand with paternal fervour and waddled off to chatter with someone else. Marian replaced several books on the reference shelves, returned others to the central desk, and was just leaving the room when again a voice made demand upon her attention. "Miss Yule, one moment, if you please." It was a tall, meagre, dry-featured man, dressed with the painful neatness of self-respecting poverty. The edges of his coat sleeves were carefully darned. His black necktie and skull cap, which covered his baldness, were evidently of home manufacture. He smiled softly and timidly with blue, rheumy eyes. 2 or 3 recent cuts on his chin and neck were the result of conscientious shaving with an unsteady hand. "I've been looking for your father," he said, as Marian turned. "Isn't he here?" "He is gone, Mr. Hinks." "Ah, then would you do me the kindness to take a book for him? In fact, it's my little essay on the historical drama, just out." He spoke with nervous hesitation and in a tone which seemed to make apology for his existence. "Oh, father will be glad to have it." "If you will kindly wait 1 minute, Miss Yule, it's at my place over there." He went off with long strides and speedily came back panting, in his hand a thin new volume. My kind regards to him, Miss Yule. You are quite well, I hope. I won't detain you.' And he backed into a man who was coming inobservantly this way. Marian went to the ladies' cloak-room, put on her hat and jacket, and left the museum. Someone passed out through the swing door a moment before her, and as soon as she had issued beneath the portico, she saw that it was Jasper Milvain. She must have followed him through the hall, but her eyes had been cast down. The young man was now alone. As he descended the steps, he looked to left and right, but not behind him. Marian followed at a distance of 2 or 3 yards. Nearing the gateway, she quickened her pace a little, so as to pass out into the street almost at the same moment as Milvain. But he did not turn his head. He took to the right. Marian had fallen back again, but she still followed at a very little distance. His walk was slow, and she might easily have passed him in quite a natural way. In that case he could not help seeing her, but there was an uneasy suspicion in her mind that he really must have noticed her in the reading-room. This was the first time she had seen him since their parting at Findon. Had he any reason for avoiding her? Did he take it ill that her father had shown no desire to keep up his acquaintance? She allowed the interval between them to become greater. In a minute or two Milvain turned up Charlotte Street, and so she lost sight of him. In Tottenham Court Road she waited for an omnibus that would take her to the remoter part of Camden Town. Obtaining a corner seat, she drew as far back as possible and paid no attention to her fellow passengers. At a point in Camden Road she at length alighted, and after 10 minutes' walk reached her destination in a quiet by-way called St. Paul's Crescent, consisting of small, decent houses. That at which she paused had an exterior promising comfort within. The windows were clean and neatly curtained, and the polishable appurtenances of the door gleamed to perfection. She admitted herself with a latch key and went straight upstairs without encountering anyone. Descending again in a few moments, she entered the front room on the ground floor. This served both as parlour and dining room. It was comfortably furnished, without much attempt at adornment. On the walls were a few autotypes and old engravings. A recess between fireplace and window was fitted with shelves, which supported hundreds of volumes, the overflow of Yule's library. The table was laid for a meal. It best suited the convenience of the family to dine at 5 o'clock. A long evening, so necessary to most literary people, was thus assured. Marian, as always when she had spent a day at the museum, was faint with weariness and hunger. She cut a small piece of bread from a loaf on the table, and sat down in an easy chair. Presently appeared a short, slight woman of middle age, plainly dressed in serviceable grey. Her face could never have been very comely, and it expressed but moderate intelligence. Its lines, however, were those of gentleness and good feeling. She had the look of one who is making a painful effort to understand something. This was fixed upon her features, and probably resulted from the peculiar conditions of her life. "Rather early, aren't you, Marian?" she said as she closed the door and came forward to take a seat. "Yes, I have a little headache." "Oh dear, is that beginning again?" Mrs Yule's speech was seldom ungrammatical, and her intonation was not flagrantly vulgar, but the accent of the London poor, which brands as with hereditary baseness, still clung to her words, rendering futile such propriety of phrase as she owed to years of association with educated people. In the same degree did her bearing fall short of that which distinguishes a lady. The London work girl is rarely capable of raising herself, or being raised, to a place in life above that to which she was born. She cannot learn how to stand and sit and move like a woman bred to refinement. any more than she can fashion her tongue to graceful speech. Mrs Yule's behaviour to Marian was marked with a singular diffidence. She looked and spoke affectionately, but not with a mother's freedom. One might have taken her for a trusted servant waiting upon her mistress. Whenever opportunity offered, she watched the girl in a curiously furtive way, that puzzled look on her face becoming very noticeable. Her consciousness was never able to accept as a familiar and unimportant fact the vast difference between herself and her daughter. Marian's superiority in native powers, in delicacy of feeling, in the results of education, could never be lost sight of. Under ordinary circumstances, she addressed the girl as if tentatively. However sure of anything from her own point of view, she knew that Marian, as often as not, had quite a different criterion. She understood that the girl frequently expressed an opinion by mere reticence, and hence the carefulness with which, when conversing, she tried to discover the real effect of her words in Marian's features. "Hungry too," she said, seeing the crust Marian was nibbling. "You really must have more lunch, dear. It isn't right to go so long. You'll make yourself ill." "Have you been out?" Marian asked. "Yes, I went to Holloway." Mrs Yule sighed and looked very unhappy. By going to Holloway was always meant a visit to her own relatives, a married sister with 3 children, and a brother who inhabited the same house. To her husband she scarcely ever ventured to speak of these persons. Yule had no intercourse with them, but Marian was always willing to listen sympathetically, and her mother often exhibited a touching gratitude for this condescension, as she deemed it. "Are things no better?" the girl inquired. "Worse, as far as I can see. John has begun his drinking again, and him and Tom quarrel every night. There's no peace in the house." If ever Mrs Yule lapsed into gross errors of pronunciation or phrase, it was when she spoke of her kinsfolk. The subject seemed to throw her back into a former condition. "He ought to go and live by himself," said Marian, referring to her mother's brother, the thirsty John. "So he ought, to be sure. I'm always telling them so. But there, you don't seem to be able to persuade them. They're that silly and obstinate. And Susan, she only gets angry with me, and tells me not to talk in a stuck-up way. I'm sure I never say a word that could offend her. I'm too careful for that. And there's Annie, no doing anything with her. She's about the streets at all hours, and what'll be the end of it no one can say. They're getting that ragged, all of them. It isn't Susan's fault, indeed it isn't. She does all that woman can. But Tom hasn't brought home 10 shillings the last month, and it seems to me as if he was getting careless. I gave her half a crown. It was all I could do. And the worst of it is, they think I could do so much more if I liked. They're always hinting that we are rich people, and it's no good my trying to persuade them. They think I'm telling falsehoods, and it's very hard to be looked at in that way. It is indeed, Marian." "You can't help it, mother. I suppose their suffering makes them unkind and unjust." "That's just what it does, my dear. You never said anything truer. Poverty will make the best people bad, if it gets hard enough. Why, there's so much of it in the world, I'm sure I can't see. I suppose father will be back soon." "He said dinner time. Mr Quarmby has been telling me something which is wonderfully good news if it's really true, but I can't help feeling doubtful. He says that father may perhaps be made editor of The Study at the end of this year." Mrs Yule, of course, understood, in outline, these affairs of the literary world. She thought of them only from the pecuniary point of view, but that made no essential distinction between her and the mass of literary people. "My word!" she exclaimed. "What a thing that would be for us!" Marian had begun to explain her reluctance to base any hopes on Mr Quarmby's prediction, when the sound of a postman's knock at the house door caused her mother to disappear for a moment. "It's for you," said Mrs Yule, returning. "From the country." Marian took the letter and examined its address with interest. It must be one of the Miss Milvains. Yes, Dora Milvain. After Jasper's departure from Finden, his sisters had seen Marian several times, and the mutual liking between her and them had been confirmed by opportunity of conversation. The promise of correspondence had hitherto waited for fulfilment. It seemed natural to Marian that the younger of the two girls should write. Maud was attractive and agreeable, and probably clever, but Dora had more spontaneity in friendship. "It will amuse you to hear," wrote Dora, "that the literary project our brother mentioned in a letter whilst you were still here is really to come to something. He has sent us a specimen chapter written by himself of the Child's History of Parliament, and Maud thinks she could carry it on in that style, if there's no hurry. She and I have both set to work on English histories, and we shall be authorities before long. Jolly and Monk offer £30 for the little book if it suits them, when finished, with certain possible profits in the future. Trust Jasper for making a bargain. So perhaps our literary career will be something more than a joke after all. I hope it may. Anything rather than a life of teaching. We shall be so glad to hear from you, if you still care to trouble about country girls," and so on. Marian read with a pleased smile, then acquainted her mother with the contents. "I'm very glad," said Mrs Yule. "It's so seldom you get a letter." "Yes." Marian seemed desirous of saying something more, and her mother had a thoughtful look, suggestive of sympathetic curiosity. "Is their brother likely to call here?" Mrs Yule asked with misgiving. "No one has invited him to," was the girl's quiet reply. "He wouldn't come without that. It's not likely that he even knows the address. Your father won't be seeing him, I suppose?" "By chance, perhaps. I don't know." It was very rare indeed for these two to touch upon any subject save those of everyday interest. In spite of the affection between them, their exchange of confidence did not go very far. Mrs Yule, who had never exercised maternal authority since Marian's earliest childhood, claimed no maternal privileges, and Marian's natural reserve had been strengthened by her mother's respectful aloofness. The English fault of domestic reticence could scarcely go further than it did in their case. Its exaggeration is, of course, one of the characteristics of those unhappy families severed by differences of education between the old and the young. "I think," said Marian, in a forced tone, "that father hasn't much liking for Mr Milvain." She wished to know if her mother had heard any private remarks on this subject, but she could not bring herself to ask directly. "I'm sure I don't know," replied Mrs Yule, smoothing her dress. "He hasn't said anything to me, Marian." An awkward silence. The mother had fixed her eyes on the mantelpiece and was thinking hard. "Otherwise," said Marian, "he would have said something, I should think, about meeting in London. But is there anything in this gentleman that he wouldn't like?" "I don't know of anything." Impossible to pursue the dialogue. Marian moved uneasily, then rose, said something about putting the letter away, and left the room. Shortly after, Alfred Yule entered the house. It was no uncommon thing for him to come home in a mood of silent moroseness, and this evening the first glimpse of his face was sufficient warning. He entered the dining room and stood on the hearthrug, reading an evening paper. His wife made a pretence of straightening things upon the table. "Well," he exclaimed irritably, "it's after 5. Why isn't dinner served?" "It's just coming, Alfred." Even the average man of a certain age is an alarming creature when dinner delays itself. The literary man in such a moment goes beyond all parallel. If there be added the fact that he has just returned from a very unsatisfactory interview with a publisher,
Wife and daughter may indeed regard the situation as appalling. Marian came in, and at once observed her mother's frightened face. 'Father,' she said, hoping to make a diversion, 'Mr Hinks has sent you his new book, and wishes—' 'Then take Mr Hinks' new book back to him, and tell him that I've quite enough to do without reading tedious trash. He needn't expect that I'm going to write a notice of it. The simpleton pesters me beyond endurance. I wish to know, if you please,' he added with savage calm, 'when dinner will be ready. If there's time to write a few letters, just tell me at once, that I mayn't waste half an hour.' Marian resented this unreasonable anger, but she durst not reply. At that moment the servant appeared with a smoking joint, and Mrs Yule followed carrying dishes of vegetables. The man of letters seated himself and carved angrily. He began his meal by drinking half a glass of ale. Then he ate a few mouthfuls, in a quick hungry way, his head bent closely over the plate. It happened commonly enough that dinner passed without a word of conversation, and that seemed likely to be the case this evening.
Chapter 7.